Form, meaning, and use for relative clauses. How is it formed? What does it mean? When and why is it used? And take a look at this word relative. And when you hear that word, you think of your aunt and uncle, your grandma and grandpa, who you are related to, who you have a relationship with. And that's important to remember as we're looking at these. Okay, let's look at how they are formed. As clauses, you're going to have a subject and a verb. And you can see here that the relative clauses are going to always begin with proforms. Those proforms are the relative pronouns, who, whom, whose, which, and that, or the relative adverbs when, where, and why. So those will be at the beginning. Sometimes they will be acting as the subject. Then you'll have a verb plus possibly some other categories that follow. Maybe an object, maybe a direct object, blah, 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 blah. And in the non-restrictive form, and when it's written, it will be set off by commas, and when it's spoken, it will be spoken as an intonation unit. And then sometimes the proform is actually dropped, which can be difficult for students, therefore, to identify them in that situation. Let's look at some examples. Here I've given you a bunch of examples of the noun as the subject, the direct object, the indirect object, the object of the preposition, and the relative clause following this noun, these noun phrases. I've given you examples of all the proforms, as well as when the proform is dropped, and then situations where the proform is the subject, and situations where it is not. So you can pause and look more closely at those if you would like to. Some challenges that I don't consider to be long-term challenges, but that I can see that students may have, is because the proforms are often the same words that we use to initiate questions, and because students usually learn to write questions before they, and to speak before they learn to speak and write relative clauses, they may have a tendency to just want to put this verb in the question form, and you may end up with sentences like these. Let's eat at the restaurant. Where did we eat last week? And so you just need to remind them we're not asking questions and help them to practice through that. And also, you may often see these clauses and other clauses left as incomplete sentences as students are grasping their understanding of when an idea, a complete idea, has been expressed and something can stand alone in a sentence, as a sentence. Okay, next, looking at what does a relative clause mean? What meaning does it bring? Well, it post-modifies the noun phrase that it follows, and it does that by qualifying, further identifying, or providing additional information concerning a quality or feature of the referent, the noun phrase that it is modifying. There are two categories or subtypes. One is restrictive relative clauses and the other is non-restrictive relative clauses. With restrictive relative clauses, often there is some knowledge assumed by the communicator on the part of the receiver. I'm assuming that the receiver knows some knowledge. And I feel that they need this knowledge to be put together in order to clarify or limit which one I'm talking about. So you've got the which one principle happening a lot with the restrictive clauses. And then with the non-restrictive, you're offering additional information that's helpful to modifying the noun phrase, but it may not be necessary. So let's look at some examples of those. A little boy comes home from school and he says, "Mom, the boy whose house burned down needs new shoes." Well, you can see how the boy is assuming that his mother already knows that there's a boy whose house burned down. And so he feels like she needs this information so she knows which boy it is that needs new shoes. And it would be strange, and we want to help students understand this, it would be strange for the boy to say this sentence if he didn't know his mom already knew this information. So there's some assuming of previous knowledge that often happens with relative clauses. Also, if I say, I cannot find the book that is due today, you can see how I feel like you need this information so you understand, first of all, which book I'm talking about, but also why I'm even saying this sentence, why I'm even worried about this book. Well, it's due today. If you tell your students you will get a 0 on homework which is turned in late, you want them to know which homework they need to be concerned about. And it's not all homework, it's the homework that's turned in late. And here again, in this last sentence, let's eat at the restaurant where we ate last week. You can see how I'm assuming that the person I'm talking to remembers this restaurant because we just ate there last week, and I want to clarify to them, and I feel like this is the best way to clarify it. Here is side by side of a restrictive and a non-restrictive. Snakes which are poisonous should be avoided. Well, I'm clarifying to you, not all snakes need to be avoided. I'm limiting it to which snakes? Well, the ones that are poisonous, although many people may disagree and think that all snakes should be avoided. And rattlesnakes, well, they should be avoided, all of them, because they're poisonous. So I don't feel like this is necessarily needed information, but it's helpful. It clarifies gives you further information about rattlesnakes, that they're poisonous. So it's not necessary information, but it's helpful. And when I say it, I'm going to have this intonation unit. Rattlesnakes, which are poisonous, should be avoided. Okay, and now we move on to why and when and why these relative clauses should be used. So one reason why we use relative clauses is to combine two ideas concerning a noun phrase into one sentence. And when we combine these two ideas about a noun phrase into a sentence, we increase their relational value. We increase how this relationship is, how this information is related, how these ideas are related to each other and to the noun phrase. It also allows us to be more concise and less repetitive when we are able to combine information that is related. So we want to try as much as possible to emphasize we're not just throwing in arbitrary information, but we're going to try to combine ideas that are related so that we can be more concise and less repetitive. To offer a slight shift in emphasis or tone to relative information. Maybe I want to shift the focus just slightly. Well, instead of putting an adjective before a noun phrase or before a noun, or instead of separating these ideas into two separate sentences, I can use a relative clause to kind of shift that emphasis. So let's look at some examples of that. Other languages that are like English in this respect include French and Spanish. Now, imagine if I needed to express the same meaning in a different form. I would have to put that in two different sentences. Other languages are like English in this way. Those languages include French and Spanish. Now, there would be nothing wrong with that, but you can see and help students to see that because this information is closely related, well, we can be more concise, less repetitive, and emphasize the fact that this information is related by placing it in a relative clause. Looking here, in most cases, the relative clause immediately follows the noun phrase it modifies. Now, how would we put that how would we have that same meaning in a different form? We'd have to, once again, have two sentences. In most cases, the relative clause immediately follows a noun phrase. It modifies that noun phrase. I think this one, even more so than this first example, this second example shows more so how it emphasizes this relationship by putting it together into one sentence, and it is definitely more concise and less repetitive. And so you can see that same kind of thing happening with this third example. I want to go down to this fourth example. The teacher gave the girls who were crying a box of tissues. Versus, the teacher gave the crying girls a box of tissues. Or maybe you could say, the teacher gave the girls a box of tissues. The girls were crying. You can see how, first of all, this information is closely related, so it makes sense to put it together into one sentence. And you can see how there's a slight shift in my emphasis. Instead of calling them crying girls and slapping this label on them, I say that they are the girls who were crying. And I have a slight change in the connotation of what I'm saying. And so that is something that would be interesting to teach students to work through understanding. You will get a 0 on homework which is turned in late. Or you can say you will get a 0 on late homework. Both of those are acceptable ways to express this meaning. But maybe I want to emphasize to my students about late homework. Then you can see how putting it in this phrase and drawing it out here is going to create more emphasis. So you can see how the longer term learning challenges are going to lie at the meaning and use level. And so these are some ideas I had. The students may struggle long-term with grasping whether or not information is related enough to want to place it in a relative clause. And so it would be helpful to teach them to ask themselves this question: is the item being described and the information about that item related enough to want to consider using a relative clause to emphasize this related information? Another challenge, they may struggle long-term with grasping when to use a relative clause in order to shift emphasis or bring about a slightly different connotation. You can do this also with this first struggle or challenge. You can also do it with practicing this connotation. You can give them examples or help the students develop examples with two different forms that provide nearly the same meaning, like I showed you in the examples on the previous slide, and try to help them see where the slight difference may be in combining them, the slight difference in connotation. And yeah, you could do that same thing here, where you're providing them with information about an item and allowing them to decide, should we combine it into a sentence or not? And then these are both looking at it from them producing the language, but you can also look at it from the point of view of them receiving language and whether they recognize when these slight shifts in connotation are happening. So help students experience the slight shifts that are happening when the relative clause is used, and think critically and analytically about why the relative clause is used and what meaning it brings to the expression. So I really think that this form, meaning, and use way of looking at language is really helpful to teaching, because instead of the traditional, we give them all the information and we ask them to form relative clauses, or we ask them to label and find relative clauses, here we're helping them to think more critically and deeply about the meaning. So that's kind of exciting, right?